Thank you for staying through. We'll move into the second part of the conversation today. Um, Carrying forward the conversation that was set out in the inaugural panel, the next panel is on enhancing regional infrastructure and connectivity. Could I please ask the panelists to come on stage? Mr. Kenichi Yokoyama, Asian Development Bank, Dr. Surat Horachaikul, Indian Studies Center in Thailand, Mr. Niruban Balachandran at the World Bank, Dr. Titli Basu at Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, and Mr. Shakti Sinha, Director of Nehru Memorial Museum and Library.
Good afternoon. The post-lunch session, the death overs. Hopefully our speakers, our four good speakers, will really enliven the proceedings. The topic, of course, is a very important one. The need for connectivity. And there are lots of lessons that we can learn, that we should learn from the past to build on. Ultimately, connectivity, whether it's hard connectivity in terms of roads and ports and airplanes and railways, but also connectivity in terms of digital connectivity and other forms of connectivity. And how do you link this? How do you, the infrastructure part, how do you make it really work together? Now, talking infrastructure is far easier than doing infrastructure. And working across countries is not always very easy. Thanks to my colleague Sanjay Pulipaka, I was just looking at some projects done as an example. Now, India built the highway, the Tribhuvan highway, to connect Kathmandu to the border of India. 50s, 3 years we built it, 120 kilometers, very good. Then India, Nepal, and the USA had an agreement, a tripartite agreement, to build 6 roads of a total of the same amount, 120 odd kilometers, 6 different roads, 1958. In 63, they wound up the agreement because we work in silos, our SOPs are different, and we are simply unable to really build it. Now, when you're looking at the kind of connectivity projects we're looking at, it will be very difficult for a single country to do it. Bilaterally makes sense, but the ability to, again, build on it and leverage support from all across makes all the difference. I'm reminded of this lovely project in Afghanistan, the Northern Electricity Power Systems. Very complicated project of getting power from Uzbekistan to Kabul over the Hindu Kush. So building substations on the way, all the kind of things. This was a, if you look at the partnership, nightmarish. Which had the USAID, which cannot work with others. USAID is not programmed to work with anybody else. We had the Germans, the World Bank, the ADB, and India. And there was one thing which worked in Afghanistan, it was the NEPS. It brought electricity to Kabul and brought good quality electricity to Kabul. So the point I'm trying to make is, it is possible to build massive regional infrastructure, spanning even countries, with different partners. Of course, a lot of things to be done bilaterally. And if you look at, say, Abu Dhabi or Tilawa, or hopefully Choktu someday, there is a lot of scope in this neighborhood. And of course, on the African side also. So much of unmet demand is there. Infrastructure by itself has no meaning unless it is connected to the whole process of economic development. No more building a port where there is no connectivity with the hinterland, as an example. So even how the choice of projects has to be obviously well thought through and not done because it looks like a good showcase project. How does it move forward on that? We have 4 eminent speakers. As good chairman, I shall follow the instructions given to me by Carnegie, and we shall follow the list given. We have about 10 minutes per speaker. I believe 3 of them have long presentations, so we'd request you to be a little brief with your presentations so that at the end of it we can get going. So may I now request Mr. Yokoyama, the country director of the India-ASEAN mission at the ADB. Sir, your 10 minutes starts now.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of ADB, I thank this opportunity to make some presentation about ADB's perspectives of regional integration through connectivity development. My presentation is covering three aspects. One is India's Act East policy as a background of the basis of our efforts. And then ADB's efforts to promote regional integration cooperation through South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation and other forums. And thirdly, just briefly touching upon Northeastern region, how we promote the integration of Northeastern region as a gateway between India, mainland, and the ASEAN countries. So first is India's Act East policy. I think this is, everybody knows that India has the Act East policy now. Now I understand that it's Act East First policy. And in that context, Northeast region development integration has been given a high priority. And we have the ASEAN-India Plan of Action 2016 to 20, and then existing efforts on service agreements and trade in goods agreement negotiation and improvement efforts are going on. So these are some efforts that ADB always try to facilitate further moving forward. And this is a very brief picture, the opportunity side, the present trade to ASEAN between India and export to ASEAN is $30 billion. But I think over the future, longer term, India has the opportunity to expand it to $800 billion. So how to capture this opportunity is a challenge and opportunity for India. And of course, we can look at the Bangladesh, Nepal, and then the inland, mainland India. But I think at this moment, as I said, the challenge is now the present level of trade in goods and services still pretty much underdeveloped. And so that provides a basis for very strongly working for the regional integration based approach. And ADB has been working for the regional integration as one of the priority agenda in our charter. And in particular in the South Asia region, we have been working as a secretariat to the South Asia Sub-Regional Economic Cooperation, which is called SASEC. And this is SAARC minus Pakistan, Afghanistan, and over the years, recently Myanmar has also joined. And this is a forum particularly focusing on projects, investment projects. And so in a sense, not much on dialogues and institutional aspects, but identifying projects and working together. And ADB is also providing additional financing for regional integration projects. So overall, I think the operational plan covering transport, trade facilitation, and energy sector have been developed. And the total investment requirement is $122 billion. And this is something that one agency cannot really absorb. So we hope that this provides a platform for various other bilateral donors, Japan, World Bank, AIB, and other banks to come together to work for this initiative. And these are some maps showing one big pillar for transport connectivity is BBIN connection, and the right side is connectivity between India's northeast to the Southeast Asia. So for that, ADB is supporting at this moment Impal-More highway, and which is going to be extended to Kohima in the next years. And trade facilitation is an important element, and customs, facilities as well as standards, SPS, and then border facilities and so on. So those are important working areas. And energy integration, South Asia, we see opportunity for power trade between the northern Himalayan states to the southern India. We increasingly focus on nowadays in the SASEC framework, the regional economic corridor development. So India East Coast Corridor, as well as Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Chennai, and the Bangladesh side, Kurna, Mongra, Chittagong. And then this economic corridor has a huge potential for integrating what's called this ASEAN Mekong India economic corridor through the Dawei port. So this is a future magnificent, I think, inspiring opportunities. And we also recently supported the BIMSTEC master plan, transport master plan. I think the master plan draft has been drafted, and I think the member governments are expected to approve and move forward. So those are some of the efforts that we have been doing on a regional basis, sub-regional basis. And then just to touch upon how the from the practical perspective, we can facilitate the development of Northeastern region. As I understand, Japanese government is also prioritizing the Northeastern region development, integrating to mainland India, BBIN, as well as the Southeast Asian region. We see a great opportunity in the Northeastern region based on the similarity of China's Yunnan province, and in terms of geographical location and potential developmental opportunities, big markets in the neighboring countries. So we saw that Yunnan's history, they started with a very comprehensive strategic plan, the investment plan, investor attraction reform plan, and so on. And then started with concrete development. This is 1992. Sub-regional integration has been a very big focus, 2010, and then by 2020, it's already highly integrated. So we can also envisage similar picture for the India's Northeastern region, but critical challenge being connectivity on the one part, and the trade and investment, second challenge, and the industry competitiveness. The Northeastern region essentially importer of high-value commodities and exporter of low-value commodities. So we need to work on connectivity as well as trade facilitation, investment promotion, and industrial development. So we have been given the opportunity to help the India's Northeastern region to develop a similar comprehensive strategy development. So covering infrastructure, connectivity, trade facilitation, and industrial development, and so on. And so this is a sample picture for what we have been supporting. This road network improvement. This is connecting northeast to Chittagong is one big opportunity. And then various roads. And this is a route for connecting northeastern region to ASEAN, Myanmar. And rail connectivity is existing but needs substantial improvement over the years. And I think government of India is putting a lot of efforts to connecting all the northeastern capitals. And inland waterway is a great opportunity. And recently we saw the India-Bangladesh protocol for free cargo movement. So that also provides a very great opportunity, but together with the development of inland waterways as a navigable route in Brahmaputra as well as the Karni-Kushiara region. And this is a sample photo picture of what industrial development opportunities exist and what will be the potential destination countries. So these efforts have been ongoing, and one big opportunity that we have been focusing on is the connecting northeastern region with Chittagong in particular. So linkage, we have been supporting various roads, but I think this requires, I understand JICA is also supporting road development between Meghalaya and Bangladesh. So we are working together on these aspects, and customs processes reforms, and then protocol, as I mentioned, is a big opportunity, and technology solutions, so there's efforts to promote motor vehicle agreement, so interchange of the countries' vehicles. And the electronic cargo tracking system, this is also a very powerful means. And we have piloted between Bangladesh and India, between Dhaka and I think Surat in Gujarat. And using this system, the transportation time, because of custom clearance procedures, I think from 28 days to 12 days. So substantial potential for facilitating the movement of goods. So in conclusion, I just want to say that there's a great opportunity for Southeast Asia, India connection, at least trade opportunities for $800 billion, which is even bigger than, several times bigger than the present India export. And then the integration strategy and a planning platform, some kind of a clear platform for planning and implementation coordination is necessary. Connectivity infrastructure and economic integration measures through economic corridor development, industrial development. And, but I need to emphasize on the effective mechanisms for coordinated planning and implementation is essentially critical. So even within India, many ministries are, coinciding, like railways and highways and state highways and energy. So the coordination is extremely challenging within India and also outside as well. And the Northeastern region, as I said, have a great potential following the development model of Yunnan. And again, the connectivity, access to Chittagong, and industrial development is something we need to focus on. And finally, harmonization of custom procedures and other trade facilitation measures are very critical means and powerful means. Not much money is needed, but this is something that probably we should also facilitate the application implementation in order to facilitate the India-ASEAN integration, trade integration. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Yokoyama. I think your last point is something which really is not enough appreciated across the country. How important trade facilitation measures, not just customs, I'll add even banking to it. If you do not have direct banking relationship, your cost of doing business goes up so much. And otherwise also harmonization of processes, the electronic tracking, all this can make a huge amount of difference. I'll now request our next speaker. You're also using slides, right? No. You're not? Well, then I'll sit here. So, Dr. Surat.
Okay, thank you very much. And first of all, if I may I express my sincere gratitude to Carnegie India and Palawan Learning System for inviting me here. My name is Surat Horachaikul. You can see the connectivity here from my face as well. I don't speak like Indians because I was born in Thailand, born and bred in Thailand. Now, Surat come from Suratana. Hora is a Punjabi surname, so the story of Indian diaspora in India is like the partition story. So you have many Punjabis there, about 2.5 lakh living in Thailand. Hora is the term coming from, the term that you use in English would be hour, because it's Indo-European. And you can see the connectivity here. We call our dean Khanabadi, which in Hindi, you would call it Ganpati, the leader of the faculty. So we have ways of using Sanskrit and Pali to invent our own words. So this is also something very good in connectivity. And when India call its program Sagar, Thai people understand straight away it's called Sakhon, because the word Sakhon come from Sagar. This is something very important for our education, connectivity, and other kinds of things as well. Now, I slightly adapted my talk today a little bit. After listening to Mr. Yokoyama, I cut out about 2-3 parts and to make it in 10 minutes. At the same time, I met few people before the Thai ambassador left this morning, and I found their questions very interesting. It's all about ASEAN as well. So if if I can use some time here, explain to you first what is ASEAN all about, because your questions seems to have a lot of expectations about ASEAN. ASEAN is not European Union. That is an apple. This is an orange. Huh? Two different families. Okay? That could be supranational. Of course, not completely successful in terms of foreign security policy, but that should be a model or not, I don't know, because Brexit is going to happen soon, no? ASEAN is intergovernmental. ASEAN was born out of nationalism. No Immanuel Kant, perpetual peace here. Huh? Nothing, right? So when ASEAN came together, it's good news. And as Ambassador mentioned before, we are so happy with ASEAN. Of course, there are certain things that we want ASEAN to improve. But if you want ASEAN to say something about China, US, India, that kind of statement that would bring about conflict, forget it. It means you don't understand ASEAN. That's not ASEAN. That's something else. So ASEAN works in its own way. There's no qualified majority voting system. It's based on consensus. You cannot interfere with domestic affairs. And that's why you have a term called ASEAN Way. Right? So you have to work in a very informal manners also, and then form yourself within that consensus. So this is something that you all should understand, that ASEAN is not the same like other regional blocs. It's of its own kind. At the same time, when you expect ASEANs to do something and you expect ASEAN member states to do something, it's two different stories. It's not the same. Yeah, we have ASEAN friends here. We start loving each other more and more now. But again, it's not Immanuel Kant or Kantian liberal world. Okay? Something else. Based on interest, based on aligned system, which could be best explained by realism. So coming together help serve certain kinds of purpose, and it can evolve from time to time. So when you say the word Indo-Pacific, what does it mean for ASEAN? Again, for ASEAN or ASEAN member states? So for ASEAN member states, yes, this is something about India's great power aspiration. Undoubtedly, India is coming up, because in Asia-Pacific, India is marginalized. So India is something in Indo-Pacific, which of course many people welcome, and people want to see more. What would India do as well? At the same time, the importance of India started to be realized by our friends here as leaders, ex-leaders of Singapore, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. This is quite clear when Mr. Lee Kuan Yew said that why India should be, entering into a dialogue partnership. Because Singapore saw it before anyone else. That's so important to get India involved in this part of the world. So for us, for many member states of ASEAN, India is seen as a balancer. These states survived the Cold War. These states lived there in that kind of environment. And to use my former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawat's statement, you have 2 feet, 1 foot in China, 1 foot in India. I'm not sure what did he mean completely, but of course, he was trying to hint something, and it reflects. At one time, the French asked us, during old time, when would Siam, old name of Thailand, be converted into Catholics? And King Narayan at that time replied back, when God desires. If God has not desired yet, then who are you to interrupt God's desire? National survival is very important. And this is how they became flexible, adaptable to survive. So you expect 10 countries of this kind of background, strong nationalist sentiments, to come up and have a statement about Indo-Pacific or China. I don't know. I've been studying about ASEAN for nearly, 20 years. And I would never expect something like that, because ASEAN has its own way of working. But it could evolve. A great ASEAN scholar like Amitabh Acharya would not like to see it evolve in such a way that it goes in European Union manners. As he said one time, he said, remain like this is better. I don't know if that's true or not, but that has to be seen. Indo-Pacific is also seen by ASEAN people as something reacting towards Chinese BRI. So a number of people are enjoying it, seeing that. Of course, we have been given more and more alternatives of development. But again, how much could India do? We will have to also see that. So when you understand ASEAN, then you also understand infrastructure. And you understand trade. You understand the role of external powers coming here. During the Cold War period, you have two camps. American involvement, Australian involvement in Thailand, very clear. Malaysia, in other parts. Then later on, it was Japanese. And I would say that the Japanese government is still one of the most important governments when it's come to influencing certain countries in Southeast Asia. In fact, we have developed so much, partly also because of Japan. Japanese foreign direct investments remain #1 in Thailand for how many years? But today you are seeing more and more of Chinese influence in the country. But largely it's because economic interests as well. Because business people run very fast to the government. Wherever there is money, business people would run. When I founded Indian Study Center 8 years ago, the prime objective was that to change the Thai perceptions towards India. Because I enjoy India so much, especially, putting me in this hotel. Yesterday, I went to Khan Market. Tomorrow, I'm planning to go to Karol Bagh, where my grandfather used to have a house there and so on, but they sold it before the property boom. That's Ganpati's fate. You can't do anything about it. Let's live with it. I enjoy it so much, and I see the potentials of India, but not many people understand that. That's why I'm working very closely with Indian Embassy in Bangkok and Thai Embassy in New Delhi to connect people. Now, with regard to infrastructures, north, south, and east-west corridors and others, you're seeing more and more of Chinese influence on that part. And then you're seeing Japanese as well. Right? But I will not deny that there have been some conflicts. But in Southeast Asia, we try to keep things low, not to make it out loud. How to balance it. Because of our country's size, this is how we see it. Now, with regard to infrastructure, which of course previous speakers have shown the charts and everything, there still remain problems. Okay. The problem is of trade facilitation, tariff barriers, and non-tariff barriers. These three factors still undermine trade relations on this part of the region. Now, before I finish my talk, I'm sure, because I have provoked some of you also, you'll have questions after that. May I persuade you to think of something quite important. First point is, has India ever evaluated its foreign policy, especially in terms of its impacts? I have been trying to search all kinds of reports from MEA, from various units, and I have not been able to find it. And you can see me here, why I am in such a position to persuade you to think on this. Because I have seen the influence of soft power from various countries. With this point on the evaluation of Indians' foreign policies, we have done a survey, and the most impactful policies of India is the ICCR scholarship for students to study in India. Once when they gather, they meet together, they always call India as their second home. I'm not sure whether this, from the Indian side, they realize this or not. But it's very impactful. One size fit all from Delhi to other countries, to different countries. One size fit all policy doesn't work. You have to understand each country has different kinds of needs. The cooperation between the Indian government and the private sectors of India. This is something I have noticed for a long, long time. The best ICT centers in Yankung in Myanmar was supported completely by the Indian government. And most graduates from there goes and works in different companies. None of them works for Indian company. And when I said, why not? I said, there's no Indian companies for me to work there in Myanmar. You don't see the cooperation. You know, the government's running this way, the private sector this way. There's some programs, undoubtedly, Tata's procurements of a Thai army on some trucks and others. We saw that, government and private sector working together, but not in every case. Yeah. Prime Minister Modi has said a number of things, very, very good. ACTIS, you know, connecting Southeast Asia with northeast of India. He called it ASEAN Gateway. And I had one program, I need to do something in northeast of India. So eventually I met some bureaucrats. And one of them asked me, "Are bhaiya, northeast mein kya hai?" To translate that, what do you get from northeast of India? You can do it somewhere else, no? So I was wondering, the prime minister levels and the bureaucrats gap, you know, huge, massive gap. Eventually I got it, what I want, because I used to live in India for 6 years, so I know the games. Don't worry, you know, I've seen all types of bureaucrats, but we have to evaluate this. Right? In Thailand, once the Prime Minister's ordered it, finished, done. Bureaucrats will never question it. Coming from the top. And I think the same applies to China also. Is MEA too small to handle all kinds of things or not? I don't know. I'm asking you a question. Looking at the size of it, doesn't much match India's great power aspiration. Now, Indo-Pacific, for many people, it's very intangible, very abstract. So I suggest that, why don't we look at something more tangible? The Indian Study Center that I helped create is also BNPTT, BIMSTEC Network of Policy Think Tank. I think we should focus more on BIMSTEC. It's very clear. We have India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, Thailand on the part. Move towards the free trade. Get it done first. And then you can always invite Malaysia and Indonesia to join. Last point, which is about tourism connectivity. I think the panel before lunch said something on tourism. This is something also we have to focus. Many Indians people are now coming to Thailand and many parts of Southeast Asia, but they tend to focus on Bangkok, Pattaya, and Phuket. Thai tourists tend to emphasize on Buddhist pilgrimage. Very good, but not enough. You have to expand it. India is more than Bodh Gaya, Banarasi, and Thailand is more than Bangkok, Pattaya, and Phuket, and others. You know. So connectivities of all kinds. You have different kinds of questions that we need to ask. So the reason why I have changed my talk a little bit here to the chairperson is because the gentleman who asked the ambassador, I'm not sure whether he's here or not, but he asked the Thai ambassador, please suggest us what should India do more to be effective? And I really like his question very much. This is something we should.
Thank you, Surat. Lots of food for thought. And as you said, you did change the focus of your talk to a very different kind of a level. Carrying on now, Mr. Niruban Balachandran from the World Bank.
I'd like to thank Carnegie India as well as Palavan Learning Systems for allowing us to talk about a topic that's timely, and I'll be talking a little bit more about Indonesia. So I won't be speaking in an official capacity. I'll be putting on my foreign policy, foreign scholar hat today. However, I will be using some World Bank data and some insights, which will probably be useful. I'll try to get through this as quickly as possible so we can have a robust discussion. We're mostly talking about key challenges to the Indo-Pacific's infrastructure and connectivity, as well as, of course, what we can do about it. As mentioned before, this presentation does not necessarily represent the official opinions or the views of the World Bank. They are entirely of my own. Quick 101, of course. We provide lending and technical assistance to developing countries. We represent 189 member countries, and our two twin goals are to end extreme poverty by the year 2030, and that is defined as living on $1.25 per day. The other goal, of course, is to increase shared prosperity for the bottom 40% that will address inequality. We do have a global infrastructure facility, which is comprised of a number of states and a number of development partners, multilateral development banks, including, for example, the Inter-American Bank as well. This is a list, that's a map of most of our projects around the world. So I'll quickly go into some disruptions to the order. probably recognize this from the journalistic body of knowledge. The liberal international order is under threat. Climate change is impacting the region. There may be a recession coming up, at least a slowdown in the economy. No comment. Is democracy dying in the region as well as the fact that China's digital capacity has increased substantially over the last decade or so. 17,500 islands, the largest archipelago on Earth. I still can't get my head around that. Indonesia is, of course, a G20 member state. It is also an OPEC member state. It is an Organization of Islamic Cooperation member state. It is multilateral to the core. This is the world's 7th largest economy by PPP, and the world's 3rd largest democracy as well. There are over 360 ethnic groups scattered throughout Indonesia. 700 over languages are spoken across the country, 260 million people, and many, many other amazing statistics. So with my apologies to Malaysia, I like to say, Indonesia, truly Asia. The regional architecture is quite complicated. Now, there is a lot of criticism that some of these multilateral fora, especially ASEAN, are central, but they may be talk shops. But as far as I'm concerned, as long as folks are talking rather than fighting, that's probably a good thing. Regional infrastructure and connectivity is also a good thing to talk about. This map goes into the numerous organizations which are central to dialogue around a number of different policy issues. But as you can see here, ASEAN is literally central to the order. Let's quickly go into Indonesia's foreign policy. Historically, what concepts have underpinned it since its inception? It's been non-aligned. The long-standing foreign policy of being bebas active or independent active is still practiced. Rowing between two reefs was a Sukarno concept, which said, well, we're not going to be trapped by either of the major powers. Dynamic equilibrium was a concept that arose a couple decades ago, and President Yudhoyono's foreign policy was, well, we need to have 1,000 friends and 0 enemies. And these days, what is talked about more is the concept of pragmatic equidistance, which means that Indonesia will not be dragged into any major power alliance or formal military pact. By definition, a foreign policy of equidistance tends to avoid hard choices. However, the short-term advantage of this is by not being dragged into any formal alliance, peace and stability tend to proliferate in the region. Another downside of that, however, is that it's possible that Jakarta it's not possible that Jakarta will join any military alliance, as I mentioned. And of course, its policy has not, for example, slowed down the militarization of the South China Sea. Now, a number of different states have convergent and competing visions for the Indo-Pacific. This was sourced from the CSIS Reconnecting Asia initiative. This is ASEAN's sort of vision. You may not be able to see it, but there's a number of maritime corridors, a couple of anchor ports in the Philippines and the lower Mekong Delta region, as well as, of course, Indonesia and Papua and Hong Kong and Singapore and so forth. That is, of course, an overview of the Belt and Road Initiative, where rail links, ports, and roads tend to predominate. This is Japan's vision for the Indo-Pacific in terms of connectivity, with a more diplomatic emphasis on countries such as Mongolia and all 5 of the Central Asian states, which were visited for the first time by a Japanese leader, Prime Minister Abe. And as you can see, there is a convergence between India's vision of connectivity for the region, and some of what Japan has promulgated as well. Lots of maritime connectivity, rail links, supply chains, and port development. So it's important to remember that India and Japan hold a wide array of infrastructure diplomacy tools for collaborations in ASEAN. Let me give you one example. This is a project that we're working on for the World Bank. In conjunction with the government's aspiration to have domestic connectivity across key islands. Some of the linkages which you can see there go all the way to East Indonesia. Now, this diagram on the right hand, it shows that these are the top 6 international shipping routes with the highest trip frequency crossings, and they cross through East Indonesia. It just so happens that port development in East Indonesia, which also tends to be one of the more remote and economically disadvantaged regions, it's not reaching its potential. So you can see again here, this is ASEAN's vision for regional connectivity. Let's say, for example, we put a transshipment hub port over in Bitung, which is on the northeast coast of Sulawesi, near Manado. A transshipment hub is different than a regular port because what it does, it tends to connect local ports with the longer international shipping routes. What implications does that have for Indo-Pacific regional connectivity? So what we did was a simulation. Well, I didn't, but my colleagues did. They did the simulation, and what you can see is, here's a question: what if Sulawesi's Bitung port becomes a transshipment hub? What we did is we assessed the benefits of upgrading selected ports to transshipment hubs, including Bitung, using what's called a network efficiency analysis. This is the current state of play. These tend to be the international shipping routes which are frequently crossed across countries. When you simulate Bitung as a transshipment hub, where containers are consolidated and then linked to international routes, especially up north, what you tend to see is that the East Indonesian ports tend to consolidate better, and you can reduce the amount of time on average by 2 days from port to port along those international routes. So it also expands market access to economically disadvantaged communities, especially those in East Indonesia. So that's just one example of how ports can play part. My last couple points here are that there are windows of opportunity for collaboration between India, Japan, and the ASEAN member states, not just Indonesia. There's lots of different policy recommendations, but here are 3 which I will propose. First of all, infrastructure connectivity should also reach poor, remote, and indigenous communities as much as possible. Second-tier cities such as Ambon and Sorong over in East Indonesia should also be prioritized as much as Jakarta and Surabaya are prioritized. I'd also like to talk a little bit about norms and values. Here we're talking about physical connectivity today, but what about the ideological, normative, and values glue that holds together infrastructure connectivity and the way that geopolitical influence is deployed across the region? It's worth considering the trade-offs between some norms which go along with infrastructure connectivity throughout the region versus, well, their counter norms. There are norms worth considering, such as shared responsibility versus the norm of non-interference. It's also worth considering the norm of inclusivity versus traditional values, which are often used as an excuse for not so nice policy choices. Citizen responsibility and social accountability with inputs from communities and civil society versus the norm of, for example, the community of common destiny. It's worth considering the trade-offs of these norms, not just the physical connectivity aspects of regional integration. And then finally, some advice for Indian, Japanese, and ASEAN firms. Ideally, they should deploy the comparative technological advantages where they tend to be strong. The typical RRP, or roads, rails, and ports, that Beijing tends to be quite good at renders other firms from other countries a little bit less competitive. But what if you consider aspects such as telecoms or electrical grids? Deploying high-tech prowess might provide firms from these trilateral partners, it might render them a little bit more competitive. So those are just some points I'd like to observe. And then finally, I'll just wrap up by mentioning one little quote to consider. This is 旧的不出，新的不来. And in Mandarin, that means, if the old does not go, then the new won't come. So from a trilateral perspective, it's good for all of us to consider these points. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Niruban, for that. Time to sweep away the old and bring in the new. Dr. Titli, Basu, over to you. What's the presentation? I came too early. I thought you did.
Thank you, Chair, and let me begin by thanking Carnegie for organizing such a timely discussion today. I will basically focus on India, Japan, and Indo-Pacific connectivity. And on Indo-Pacific, as we all know, it is basically a maritime super region with critical sub-regions. And since the theme is ASEAN, so my presentation will briefly play with the ideas in Southeast Asia. So let me begin by saying that the Indo-Pacific construct is increasingly framing India's geostrategic and geoeconomic policy choices. As the regional fluidity is shaping our policy debates or Indo-Pacific discourse both in New Delhi and in Tokyo, there are certain common elements in our respective Indo-Pacific vision which defines India-Japan, a winning combination in the Indo-Pacific, which is founded on what my previous colleague was mentioning about shared universal values and mutuality of strategic interests. Talking about the commonalities that is quite evident in the Indo-Pacific strategy that Tokyo, New Delhi, or Washington, for that matter, is debating right now is primacy of ASEAN, the ASEAN centrality, as you see in the policy discourse. Second is securing maritime global commons by fostering security cooperation with like-minded countries and leveraging our strategic partnerships in Indo-Pacific. And the third, which is the theme of this session, is pushing forward robust connectivity and infrastructure projects in the critical subregions of Indo-Pacific, particularly Bay of Bengal, Mekong region, Indian Ocean, and Africa. But as I mentioned, I will be only focusing on Southeast Asia this afternoon. If you look at how India has approached regional infrastructure, at the Shangri-La Dialogue, India's vision was quite categorically articulated by Prime Minister Modi. And there he has defined certain elements of Indo-Pacific strategy. And infrastructure, certainly, infrastructure and connectivity was one of them. And India wishes to pursue regional infrastructure based on this common understanding on respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, consultation, good governance, economic feasibility, and so on and so forth. And if I look at Tokyo's approach to regional infrastructure development that they are pursuing under EPQI, Expanded Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, and lately, since 2017, we have seen their approach towards BRI is kind of evolving, and we have seen China-Japan third country projects coming up. But the support that Japan is lending to Chinese projects or any other infrastructure projects that they are pursuing in Southeast Asia or elsewhere is also, pursuing similar elements. The support to BRI projects are conditional on four similar kind of principles on openness, transparency, economic feasibility, and responsible debt financing. So, given this, India and Japan as Asian, major economies in Asia, they have coordinated in forward thinking, and kind of defined the Indo-Pacific Vision 2025. If you remember, in the 2015 summit meeting that happened, we have come up with a joint Indo-Pacific Vision of 2025, which also talks about several issues, including coordinating and cooperating bilaterally, and also with third country partners, particularly the United States, in terms of pursuing our infrastructure and connectivity projects, with the objective of enabling regional production networks, economic integration, as was mentioned by previous speakers, to push regional value chains and tap the potential of Indo-Pacific that it has to offer. Now, if I look at, as I mentioned, if you look at the Indo-Pacific strategy of both India and Japan, and also the joint vision of 2025, Southeast Asia emerges as one of the fundamental pillars of this strategy. And Southeast Asia is also a region, as was mentioned, where strategic competition among great powers is unfolding. There is emergence of dual hierarchies, as Ikenberry has mentioned, the security hierarchy being dominated by US and the economic hierarchy by the Chinese. And this is also the theater where our actist policy converges with Japan's free and open Indo-Pacific vision. And if you look at ASEAN, it is the third largest economy in Asia and the sixth largest in the world, I suppose, with a 2.6 trillion market, 8.5% of global population, I think 6.2% of global GDP. So, and it is also enmeshed in Asian regional production networks and global value chains. So if I look at India's trade with Southeast Asia, as of now, it stands at $82 billion, with a trade deficit of around $12 to $13 billion in favor of ASEAN. But if I compare it with the Chinese economic engagement or bilateral trade, it stands at $441 billion, and with a trade surplus on the Chinese side. So this one of the reasons why India has not been able to tap the potential of ASEAN is particularly because we have not been able to integrate ourselves with the regional production networks, because the catalyst for regional production networks is to reduce trade costs, and efficient, effective infrastructure and connectivity plays a great role in reducing the cost, in enhancing competitiveness, and also bringing in stability of supply. So given this, if I look at all the projections today of whether it is of IMF or whether it is of ADB, I'll not go into the details. Southeast Asia holds a lot of promise, and so does India. So if we need to tap the economic opportunities provided by this region, then we need to develop seamless infrastructure and connectivity. I think it's quite well known that various studies are done by regional multilateral development banks on projecting infrastructure requirement. One such study was done by ADB in 2017, which said that I think there is a requirement of $26 trillion dollar investment through 2030 in developing Asia. If I look at our own our government's, India's assessment, we are trying to set a target of becoming a $5 trillion economy in the next 5 years. And our Ministry of Finance has, in the economic survey, has suggested that we require a 4.5 trillion investment in infrastructure through 2040 to sustain the kind of economic agenda that we have set for ourselves. So, if I look at the infrastructure or connectivity architecture in India today, there are certain salient features. One is there is alignment of our national infrastructure and connectivity projects that is aimed at enabling industrial modernization through mega industrial corridors, dedicated freight corridors, the vertical and horizontal Bharatmala connectivity that we have. All this is aligned with our regional infrastructure projects or the visions or the plans that we right now have. For example, if I talk about Southeast Asia, one is the Trilateral Highway, the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway, which is aligned with the Asian Highway. And as I think we all are aware that there are plans of extending it to Vietnam. And if that happens, I think we can further able to use the kind of infrastructure Japan is pursuing, the horizontal infrastructure corridors that Japan is pursuing in Southeast Asia, particularly the Southern Economic Corridor and the East-West Transport Corridor. That will be helpful. Second is the Mekong-India economic cooperation. Now, we all know that India is pursuing its first coastal corridor, the Eastern Coastal Corridor, and ADB is helping us financing the stretch from Vizag to Chennai. And if you look at the other side, there is alignment of this with the other industrial corridor project, that is Chennai-Bangalore project, which is again done by Japanese bilateral ODA. So if, Chennai port modernization has also benefited from the technical cooperation of Japanese bilateral aid dispersed through JICA. So if we can enable Chennai as a nodal port, that can actually help in realizing the concept that we have right now of Mekong India economic corridor, which goes to Dawei and then from Bangkok to Phnom Penh to Ho Chi Minh City. And the second issue that I want to talk about is getting connected to Southeast Asia through the Northeast Indian axis, which has been already talked about. And Japan has emerged as a natural partner, as Prime Minister Modi said, as a natural partner in our Northeast development. We have a cumulative, if we look at the last decade, we have a cumulative commitment of soft loans from Japan of 3 lakh crores from the Japanese side. And they do have a lot of national economic policies which have also been complementary to our Make in India projects. For example, the EPQI, which has in 2016 it committed $200 billion for pursuing infrastructure in Asia and Africa. How it is different from their ODA is it's much more comprehensive, and it is more amenable to high-risk projects, and also it encourages a role of JBIC in terms of pursuing infrastructure projects in public and private partnership. It also calls for coordination, greater coordination with ADB. We do have institutionalization of our Northeast connectivity or cooperation with the Japanese in Northeast through our Actist Forum. I think we all, we have seen from the previous presentation a lot of details on the, what we are doing in Northeast, particularly with the Japanese bilateral ODA. We are getting modernization in national highways 51, 54, 40. We are also doing something with the ADB in the Gelefu-Dalu corridor. The other thing in the trilateral framework that we can pursue is, as we know that we have a trilateral with the US, and there is an infrastructure working group there. So with EPQI commitments from the Japanese, we have a $1 billion line of credit for infrastructure projects in ASEAN, and also with the BUILD Act and institutionalization of the development financing corporations. I think we can come together and really do some brainstorming to develop some projects in Southeast Asia. I'll not go too much into details. In 2016, the Vientiane Declaration that happened in ASEAN has also talked about planning and conceiving, spotting projects, identifying projects, and financing and sourcing technical assistance and financing from all sources: ADB, AIIB, EPQI, India's $1 billion line of credit that we have with the ASEAN. Now, in this, I would like to draw your attention that, as was mentioned, ADB, besides JICA, ADB is also doing a lot of infrastructure projects in India. So when we are planning, I think one thing which will be useful for us is greater alignment. When India and Japan are discussing more on infrastructure projects or identifying new projects, it will be useful if we synergize those new projects with complementary ADB projects. To cite because if you look at ADB financing and JICA financing from Japan, transportation sector has gotten the most financing, with JICA giving 64% of their soft loans in the last decade in the transport sector. Transport sector also benefited from the highest recipient from the ADB. So in Northeast also, as mentioned, SASEC and Northeast Infrastructure Investment Program, there are a lot of Asian highways, sections of Asian highways that ADB is modernizing. So those kind of more coordination and alignments will be good. For example, one we are already seeing in Northeast, because the Tura-Dalu corridor is done by JICA, and the Gelefu-Dalu corridor is further extended by ADB. Similarly, in Chennai, as I mentioned, the Chennai-Bangalore corridor by JICA and the Chennai-Vizag corridor by ADB. So if we tap these resources from the Japanese side, I think we will be able to achieve, maximize our interest of integrating into the regional value chains. Quickly, I'll just come to the Maritime Connect part. As mentioned, it is very important to reduce our transportation costs and the time for moving logistics through the Fredo corridors, and MIEC, the Mekong India Economic Corridor, will be pursued with that objective. Connectivity through Myanmar is vitally important for India in Southeast Asia when we are looking at it. Sitwe is one example. And another example where Japanese could be useful to us is because they are engaged in the Dawei port. So with the SEZ also, I think once the Mekong India Economic Corridor runs through Chennai to Dawei, we can conceive some projects there. And finally, wrapping up, I will say that it is important for us to, when we go ahead and plan, to map the missing links and infrastructure financing gaps when we talk about India-ASEAN connectivity. For example, as I said, Myanmar, we can build the missing links from Dawei so that it can further our trade through the region. India's infrastructure projects has also had a little bit of hiccups with our operational efficiency and timely delivery of projects. Resources and capabilities have been a problem for us, but I think we should be looking at leveraging our strategic partnerships with countries like Japan in order to further our infrastructure connectivity agenda in the region. And I think Japan is in a very good position to help us connect through Southeast Asia, not only through JICA, but also through JBIC and ATP. Thank you.
Thank you. We are actually very close to the end, but since we started about 9 minutes late, let's open it up to question and answers. Mr. Andrew Collins. We'll combine questions so that to save time. Okay, I'll be very quick. Yeah, I saw that hand there. And yeah, right, the lady there. Under 35 gets the first chance. Rajiv? I'm looking around.
I'm Rajiv Chaturvedi from RSIS. My question is to Dr. Surat. You alluded to the small size of MEA, and I'm based in Singapore, so I see a lot of complaint about India's delivery deficit. How much has changed? Do you see in the last few years there are some changes? If yes, how much?
Can I look around for anybody else? Mr. Yokoyama. Okay, your question, Surat, was, have you seen any change in MEA over the years in terms of its ability to deliver, right? Yokoyama?
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, regarding the infrastructure financing, I think from the present status in India is, I understand that infrastructure annual investments is like $100 billion already, whereas out of which about 30% coming from the private sector. Well, I think slightly less because of discounting issue. And National Highway Authority, Railway, to some extent has come to the stage of, issuing the bonds on their own. So in that sense, that part, no longer term funding, we are expecting that is a kind of trend, and we have been, somewhat discussing over the future whether ADB can be a more like, insurer or guarantor of the private capital loans. So that's one direction. But at the same time, in the Indian context, probably I think financing is one constraint, but also now the capacity of planning and design is also another huge constraint. And if there are sufficient number of DPRs ready for investment, then I think a lot of discussion can take place. Which funding come from where, whether the mature agency can issue bonds like power grid has a lot of capacity. But on the other hand, I think that's one area, particularly in the northeastern region. We want to do more, but the proposals are not there. So now, latest discussion with DEA is that we can also help providing support for grant and loans to prepare DPRs, so that a lot of ready proposals are there. And in that context, this issue of complementarity also coming, and DEA somehow suggests they also want AIIB and NDB also come to investment. Of course, the JICA World Bank is also there. So once the DPR ready projects are developed in the northeastern region, then as I mentioned, there's a potential of even $100 billion over there. So then we can discuss which agency, which donor, and also railway and now it's a national. NHIA has a sister organization called NHIDCL, which can also get funding from NHAI. So in that sense, I think, first requirement, as we see in the northeastern region, is prepare viable investment plan which can serve as a platform for many donors and financiers and come together.
Here's the point about convergence, or how do you, when it's an ADB project, JICA project,
Actually, in the context of northeastern region, we sometimes discuss with JICA, and particularly, one particular example is, say, highway between More, Impal, and Kohima. So initially, I think the government seems to have been interested to work with JICA, but because of some security concerns on Japanese government, so we are stepping in. So in that sense, that level of coordination is taking place, but also that coordination is really driven by the government of India. So it's Department of Economic Affairs and MDONA looking at which donors are available. Yeah.
Absolutely.
In terms of improvement for MEA, before 1991, bad. After 1991, looked east. I think roughly 1997, 1998, you start to see MEA very active in different parts of Southeast Asia. Then after ACTIS, of course, more active. But again, to capture those potentials, what Dr. Basu was saying, a lot of things in terms of commerce, connectivities, and many other kinds of things. India miss out a lot of things. And this is something that it has to evolve. You see, trying to provoke you also to think of it. We have to evaluate it. International Day of Yoga, for example. Excellent. Okay? Very popular. Certain programs, very popular. But when it's come to commerce and other kinds of things, you compare India and China and other countries, India seems to be behind. Why is that so? That's why we decided to focus on this study. And we tried so hard to find the evaluation report of MEA, evaluation of Indian foreign policies. And until now, I haven't got one. Yeah, thanks.
We're already out of time, but is somebody with a very good question? No? Okay, let me do a quick wrap-up, very, very quick wrap-up. I'll tell you how, I mean, it's my understanding, and I'm subject to correction. You know, the three biggest ports in the world handling Indian cargo, exports and imports. None of them are located in India physically. They're Singapore, Colombo, and Dubai. The point that Niruban, you made about Bidung or Sabang, Kalang is also coming up. There is so much of scope to develop infrastructure, not just looking at yourself, but how you're positioned. Look at the city state of Singapore. Singapore's trade to GDP figures, I don't have the numbers now, it is by 250% due to the free exports. You know? The fact is, how do you leverage yourself? You must be part of larger networks, and therefore the behind the border issues. The fact that a container can pass through or a vehicle can pass through smoothly and not be held up. If you go to the India-Bangladesh border at Binapol, Petropol, it's changed a lot over the years. When I went in the 90s, it would take a truck literally 10 days, 12 days to stay there before you offload it. Look at the business costs involved, humongous. Now it's very, very low, but if you have just movement of trucks passing through the borders, using electronic tracking mechanisms, which are very simple these days, just imagine the gains. If you don't have banking relationship, if you want an Indian buyer or Indian seller and a buyer in Yangon, because there are no Burmese banks here or Indian banks there, or they don't even have correspondent relationship, you don't have to be physically present, you can have a correspondent relationship with the banks. You don't. You bank through Singapore, just at the cost. Now it seems each cost looks very, very small, you know, 10 basis points, 15 basis points, it looks irrelevant, right? But you accumulate it and you accumulate the time, it really makes a lot of difference. Having said that, we have seen lots and lots of improvements. I'm always a little skeptical about numbers of amounts involved for investments. It's a good starting point, but the number should not paralyze us into thinking, oh God, where are I going to get $5 trillion, you know? That should not paralyze us. There are lots of things to be done. And as I said, it's the networking that is important. You supply electricity to Bangladesh, 100 megawatts. You apply through one line. Supposing there were 15 lines of 300, we could take 300 or something. You can step it up, you can bring it down, and you're insulated against the shock. Supposing an earthquake comes and knocks your line off, which means for 6 months you can't supply electricity. So, you know, that is the kind of thing that you need to enmesh your economies into each other for the good of all of us. It's not that I benefit. If Bangladesh becomes the hub of northeast of India, which is positioned to be, look at the map, Bangladesh is the natural hub of northeast of India. Getting in raw materials, processing them, selling it back into India. This benefits everybody. So I think we need to really move the argument, and as I keep, let's get specific also. It's good to talk in general terms. What are the specific fruits that can be picked relatively easy? What are the structural impediments that are blocking it? How do you tackle that? So for that, you need to be beefed up. You need really to beef up. I completely agree with Surat. You need to really beef up your system to make it more efficient. The Kenichi, I don't think so you can get away from the fact that the railways will be dealt by different ministry than highways. Even if I put them together, within the ministry you'll have silos working. There are certain things I think that bureaucracies, your bureaucracy, I'm sure Niruban's bureaucracy, we know these things exist. How to make it simpler is the answer. Carnegie India, Pallavan, thank you very, very much. I think we've had a good session. All three, let's give a round of applause to our four speakers.
Thank you. We are now finally moving on to, we are now moving on to the final session. We spent most of the day talking about trilateral cooperation between India, Japan, and ASEAN. And this session is going to look at particularly where this collaboration can go and which are the bilateral countries perhaps we can look at. Could I please ask the panelists to come on stage? Dr. Thuy T from the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, Dr. Rani D. Mullen from the National University of Singapore, Mr. Sanjay Polipaka, Nehru Memorial Museum and Library, and Dr. Rajeshwari Rajagopalan, Observer Research Foundation.
So I think throughout the day, I think you have had a couple of fascinating sessions looking at trilateral cooperation, India, Japan, ASEAN, in a thematic fashion, looking at maritime, looking at regional connectivity, developmental cooperation, and so on and so forth. I think in this panel, what we are trying to do is what are the kind of prospects, what are the challenges, what are the issues, how we might actually make the thematic cooperation that we have discussed into a more of a reality in a sense. Clearly, I think first, before I start off, I think this is a terrific panel. More so because talk about gender sensitivity, gender balance, I think we have 3 women, 1 single male member panel. I think kudos to Carnegie India for that, because I think that's something, again, so we already won the game, so to say. But clearly, I think when you come to the subject, I think Asia is going through some very interesting times. As they say, there are several reasons. Of course, you can now see the return of the Quad, the Indo-Pacific concept, and several number of trilaterals and minilaterals taking shape in Indo-Pacific. And that's clearly a reflection of something strategic of consequence that is kind of brewing in the region in a sense. And that has brought us back here to talk about all of these issues. While there are several different factors, I think China's rise has been, that's a big elephant in the room. That has been much more strategically consequential in a sense, and what they have done with their economic growth, but also that economic growth has actually driven them to spend a lot more money even in the defense and military capabilities and so on and so forth. According to the latest data from CIPRI, many of the Asian countries had also the largest defense spending powers. Countries in the region accounted for something like 40% of the global arms import during the period 2014-18. As for the defense spending goes, China recently announced a budget of about 1.19 trillion yuan, which translates to something like $176 billion US dollars. This represents a slightly slower growth rate than the previous year, which had seen an 8.1% growth rate, to something like today, 7.5% growth rate. But the fact is that given the huge sum of money that they are spending in military terms, on military matters, and this is, at least from an Indian perspective, I can say that this is more than 3 times that of India's spending, and clearly that would have a clear imbalance in the kind of military capabilities. And I'm sure that is the kind of case for many of the ASEAN countries, as well as for Japan, when they compare the military expenditure figures. But the military expenditure is just one part of the puzzle, but I think that's where we have an excellent panel to debate these particular issues, looking at a different set of issues. I think at one level, we need strategic and security cooperation among the three countries, but I think we also need something more substantive. And I think what are the various substantive issues that we can look at to create that kind of synergy and cooperation among the three set of partners, whether it is in terms of developmental sort of cooperation and regional connectivity issues, or maritime security, and so on and so forth. To explore these particular aspects, we have three speakers. Dr. Thuy T, she's the Vice Dean at the Faculty of International Politics and Diplomacy at the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam. Second, Dr. Rani Mullen, who is currently the Visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore, and Mr. Sanjay Pulipaka, Senior Fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. So now, without further ado, let me call the first speaker, Dr. Duo, to make your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my honor to be invited to this very important conference. Just last year, our academy, in collaboration with our Indian, Bangladesh, and Singapore partner, organized the third Indian Ocean Conference, which is the largest conference that our academy has ever organized in Hanoi, to discuss about building the regional structure, regional architectures in the Indo-Pacific. And today, I'm very happy that more specific steps have been convened in order to discuss a very, I would say, concrete measure in how to promote cooperation for stability in the region. So my speech will be on the trilateral cooperation between Vietnam, Japan, and India for promoting stability in the Indo-Pacific from a very Vietnamese perspective. So the first, as a small to medium country, Vietnam see the regional context as intertwined between many challenges, but also some opportunities. At the one hand, we see the growing strategic competition between the superpower, including China and US trade war, and also in terms of maritime security, and also the rise of nationalism and trade protectionism at some place in the world, and it comes with the fear or the concern about the US withdrawal from leadership. But at the other hand, we also see some positive movement, including the robust economic development. Vietnam is a case in point, but many of our Indian and also ASEAN partners as well. And also we continue to see the regionalism to develop very, very robust. And in this case, you can see that that is the survey and a research by the Lowy Institute in Australia in mid-2018, and they rank the power ranking of regional country in the Indo-Pacific. And here you can see that beyond China and the US being ranked as a superpower, so India and Japan being seen as the major power, and you can see that Vietnam, they include Vietnam as the rising emerging middle power. So the nature of the trilateral cooperation between Vietnam and the two countries, India and Japan, is a cooperation between a small to middle style, medium countries, which is also a member of ASEAN country and the two regional major power. So you can see that Vietnam here, you can see that since President Trump introduced the term Indo-Pacific, Free and Open Indo-Pacific Initiative Da Nang, there has been many debate about the content of this vision. And also here, the U.S. vision is somehow elaborated by the Deputy Assistant Secretary Alex Wong, when he said that free here, it means that free from coercion, free from force, and also includes some notion of good governance, and open in terms of navigation, and also logistic, including infrastructure, investment, and trade. And after that, we also see that the Indian and Japanese leaders call out their specific viewpoint about the architecture of the Indo-Pacific region. And we are very delighted that both India and Japan highly value the centrality of ASEAN in the building of the upcoming, in the making architecture of the Indo-Pacific, and both countries also see the possibility of increasing connectivities and common prosperity of the region, and particularly both countries also see it as in an inclusive way that not exclude anyone, including the small and medium state in the region. Vietnam has made it clear that it supports any new initiative and effort to connect the region, including BRI as well as for it, as long as those initiatives have to realize the 5 things. The first one, that those initiatives should contribute to peace, stability, and common prosperity in the region. And second, it should respect international law and the independence and sovereignty and territory integrity of regional state. And the third thing, which is also the key highlight, that is those initiatives should maintain ASEAN centrality. And as the Thai ambassador stated this morning, ASEAN has somehow come up with a common approach to the vision of the Indo-Pacific. So Vietnam, as an ASEAN member, also make an effort in forging a common viewpoint of ASEAN member in that term. And number 4, it should promote an open and inclusive region that does not exclude anyone. So it means even the small power as well as some other power, including China, should be incorporated that. And lastly, we prioritize area of economic connectivities as well as infrastructure development, which are mutual benefit and also in line with international law. So exactly 1 year, before, when our president, the late President Trần Đại Quang, visited India in March last year, he has somewhat paid now about the Vietnam vision of the emerging Indo-Asia-Pacific. So it means that Vietnamese perspective is a little bit inclusive of the Asia as the central of the coming Indo-Pacific architecture. So we pretty much, that's why we place the term Asia in the middle. So it means Asia will be, and ASEAN centrality will continue to be relevant in the any vision of the upcoming with the Indo-Pacific region. And based on that, you can see that Vietnam share the common vision and interest with India and Japan in largely the 4 points. The first thing is that I think that both on the 3, including the promotion of international laws and not changing the status quo by force. And also we share a common interest in the maintenance of peace, stability, and inclusive prosperity. And second, when many people, when talking about a trilateral cooperation, focus more on the South China Sea dispute. So this is the common point of concern when both the 3 countries want to protect the freedom of navigation and also aviation, and particularly unimpeded trade in the South China Sea, but also in other parts of the sea that across the Indo-Pacific region. And we may have some common interest in establish effective mechanism to maintain peace and stability and the rule of law in the region, and particularly to promote to the security in the region, including maritime security, but also the control of the flashpoint, other flashpoint as well, including the Korean Peninsula. So that's the vision of how we should contribute to peacemaking and also prevent conflict and war and address security challenge, including traditional security challenge as well as the non-traditional security challenge. And lastly, we share some common vision in terms of enhancing regional connectivity and mutual development. So you see here This is the map of the key partnership of Vietnam. So Vietnam, since the end of the Cold War, we had adopted a very balanced foreign policy, open-minded foreign policy that does not seek to join any military alliance. But instead of that, we rely on our partnership with our key member countries in the Asia-Pacific region. And you can see here, India at the moment is one of the 3 comprehensive strategic partners of Vietnam, and while Japan has been a long-term strategic partners of Vietnam since 2007. And here you can see that apart from these 2 countries, Vietnam also have very good relations with other power, including China, Russia, and the US, as well as other members in the Quad, including Australia. And of course, we have a very good relation with our own other member of the ASEAN countries. So that brings to the philosophy of the Vietnamese diplomacy, which I think that I term it in a term of like clumping bamboo diplomacy with no formal ally, but how can Vietnam promote our interest in this changing world? So we build interdependent relationship with our key partner and trying to adopt a strategy of diversification of Thai as well as enmeshment. So try to build the clump with other partners. So I think that based on ASEAN is one of the big clump that Vietnam can rely on. But the relationship with China, with India, and Japan are also very important tie that we should promote. So here are the very brief key area of cooperation that the 3 countries can promote. The first thing, Vietnam is at the moment very keen on economic development, and you can see India and Japan as among our leading economic partners, particularly Japan, in many sense, including ODA provision to investment, to trade, but also India is ranking among the top 10 of Vietnam trade partner as well as investor. So the 3 countries, I think, has many common interests in economic development, including what we call here the sustainable development goals. Vietnam has done pretty well in this sense in terms of implementing the UN MDG and now moving to the SDG. So in this sense, Japan and India, as the more advanced economies, can help Vietnam in this sense. And second thing, in terms of trade and investment, there's much room to maneuver, particularly in the case of bilateral relation between India and Vietnam, because at the moment the bilateral trade will remain is in development, but remain modest, about 12 billion USD per year. So we set a plan for bringing it up to 15 billion by 2020, which I think that there is still much room to maneuver. And also in terms of the human resource, that's one thing to including education and also capacity building, which is very much appreciate. In terms of the much talk area of cooperation, e-economy and blue economy is also the case that in point that Vietnam has paid attention to, particularly in recent years. So last year we organized, we host the Web ASEAN, the World Economic Forum on ASEAN in August last year. And now what had been agreed by regional countries that the future kind of economy should be focused on innovation and technology, and Vietnam has been paying a lot of attention on that. And as we all know that India and Japan are the 2 largest hubs in terms of technology and also innovation. That those are also very big. In terms of infrastructure, I will mention in the regional connectivities. And also in terms of energy, the 3 countries, particularly India, has some oil and gas exploration enterprises with Vietnam, but also Japan, and the 2 countries are also helping Vietnam in developing civil nuclear energy. So those are of course a big room for cooperation over there. And in terms of security, a case in point here is the maritime security, particularly in the point of concern of Vietnam, that is the South China Sea dispute. So we all upheld the rule of law here by means of navigation and aviation, and peaceful settlement of territory dispute, and particularly the non-threat or use of force, particularly using flexing the muscle power use of force to threaten the smaller power, a smaller state in the region. And in terms of capacity building, both India and Japan have assisted Vietnam a lot with providing patrol for the Vietnam what we call maritime police, law enforcement, and also helping in terms of enhance their capacity in terms of naval forces as well. And here you can see that some of the Korean Peninsula and also the East and South China Sea dispute, and you see that recently Vietnam has been quite eager in terms of serving as the a good office, or what we call the broker for international conflict, including the second Trump-Kim summit in Vietnam. And lastly, the non-traditional security issues, including climate change and also cyber security, are also very promising, I think, that in terms of cooperation. So in both the economic and security field, you can see that there are a lot of converging interests between these three nations. And in terms of regional connectivities, my colleagues from India and Japan has talked a lot, but some of the specific projects in my that I can name here is the first thing that my Indian colleague just mentioned about the possibility of extending the India-Myanmar-Thailand Trilateral Highway to Vietnam. So if that is possible, that will help with the movement in terms of the Indo-China highway. And we also have other mechanisms, including the Mekong sub-region, the Mekong-Ganga Cooperation, and the East-West Corridor. And this morning, our colleague also mentioned about the possibility of involving Vietnam as a third party in terms of the Asia-Africa road corridor. So that may be of interest as well. And as Vietnam is a ASEAN member, so you can see that in terms of multilateral framework, there is also great hope for cooperation as well. So including, we strongly promote the international law and the rule-based order, and it's our common interest that ASEAN and China can conclude what we call the code of conduct in the South China Sea, which will serve as the first kind of conduct in the dispute that China have involved, including serving as the benchmark for other dispute as well, including the East China Sea and not elsewhere. And we are members of many ASEAN-led mechanisms, including the ARF, the EAS, and the Shangri-La Dialogue. And here, there is also possibility of coordination in the regional wider platform, including APEC, CPTPP, particularly Japan and Vietnam has worked very closely in pushing the CPTPP to an end after US President withdrew from the TPP, former TPP. So the role of Japan and India and Vietnam also very important in this sense. And we also have the wider region in the UN system. So to conclude, you can see here, this is the diagram prepared by the Vietnamese MFA, in which we actually they capture all kinds of the multilateral network in the Indo-Pacific, and you can see that both India, Japan, and Vietnam has participated in many of these regional platforms. So I think that in general, the interests between the three countries are largely converged in this sense in many fields, and both bilaterally, trilaterally, and also multilaterally. So that's why in the coming time, I'm very much hoping that this vision or some initiative can be put into practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Do, and I think you raised some very interesting points. We'll come back to it in a few minutes. Over to you, Dr. Mullen.
Oh, sorry about that. Yeah, I hope you can hear me now. Let me just first start off by thanking Carnegie for putting this together, as well as Palavan Learning Systems. It's been a really interesting learning experience for me here, and I think there's been a lot of food for thought, and hopefully these conversations will continue well beyond. I wanted to start off by making the general case for development cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. There's been much regional development cooperation in this region. It has been increasing, the number of partners engaged has been increasing, and while there's a lot of demand, the supply has also been increasing, and I think we've heard a lot of different examples of that today. But I also think that it's important to keep in mind why countries are engaging in development cooperation. It's sort of a win-win. Countries want to engage to help each other out, but it's also important to keep in mind that development cooperation is increasingly also a vehicle for geopolitical competition. Why is it that India, once China got involved in Hambantota port, why is it then that India and Japan and other countries are now looking at perhaps funding Trincomalee port, right? This is not because Sri Lanka has necessarily asked while they have done that, but there's a geostrategic, a geopolitical element to development assistance that I think we all need to keep in mind. The other is that there are many regionally focused initiatives which aim to integrate the region, and most of them are focused on government to government, and it's trying to integrate the recipient country with interests stemming from the donor country. And of course, the big elephant in the room today has been China and China's BRI program. That to say that most development cooperation, there's the multilateral and then there's the bilateral. But what we're talking about, this trilateral, and trilateral with two bilateral countries who engage bilaterally, as well as hopefully increasingly ASEAN, is rather a new configuration, and there's a greater need to see more of that. So just to point out a couple of pros and cons we've seen this countries embracing the increase in development funding in this region and more competition in development funding. That of course is good for recipient countries such as Cambodia, we heard about Vietnam just now, but also Sri Lanka and others in the region. There's still, as pointed out by various presenters today, huge demand, right? There's a huge need in the region for development assistance. But there's also this, it's a win-win for recipients when they see more potential donors coming in, giving them more choice, giving them access to different kinds of aid. And some of the newer aid that is coming in comes, at least initially, seemingly, with fewer strings attached. So these are some of the pros from the recipient country's perspective. But I think we also need to keep in mind some of the cons. We've seen rising concerns about the increased risks coming along with the influx of aid, including this issue of becoming over-dependent on any one country for development assistance. The issue that also has been mentioned today of needing to keep debt levels down, manageable. We're starting to see countries that are highly indebted and how that impinges on their sovereignty and their issues. And by that I don't only mean countries that are sort of in the middle income range. China has a port in Australia. There are Chinese owned ports in Europe. So this question of how does one keep debt manageable, and how, as it becomes unmanageable, how that impinges on the strategic options and sovereignty issues of a country. And then I also wanted to point out that some of the newer aid has has less due diligence, if you will, in terms of the selection of projects, perhaps less financial viability studies, less environmental and social assessments, and these all can then lead to risks in terms of the projects themselves, as well as for the country, for the recipient country in terms of its debt. ASEAN, I'll skip over this rather quickly, just to show you that the graph there shows that while aid that has been given through ASEAN has increased, so have aid flows within Southeast Asia that are separate from ASEAN. So that just to say that there's increasingly, as we've heard today, an argument to be made for ASEAN's centrality in development cooperation, that historically, when we've talked about aid, it's been a bilateral issue, but as we've seen, it's becoming a more prominent issue within ASEAN, and hopefully, as we heard earlier today from the Thai ambassador, there is now movement within ASEAN in this direction to have set up perhaps a coordinating or thinking about moving in terms of coordinating mechanism there. But there are clear structural impediments within ASEAN. It would require much more autonomy for these structures that are there within ASEAN to coordinate sectoral bodies, policy centers, etc. Would require more money, and there is the issue of factor time, right? Things move slowly within ASEAN, and given the strategic interest there, there's a need to speed up some of these structural changes. In fact, when you look at Japan, India, and ASEAN and development cooperation, it's ASEAN that's the weak link in terms of engaging historically also with other partners. And yet there are a few examples of trilateral cooperation, triangular cooperation, most of them government to government to government, right? So I have a couple of examples up there, but the key there is that we haven't quite seen as much of triangular cooperation that involves organizations such as ASEAN. And yet, there are clear benefits in that configuration of Japan, India, and ASEAN that are important to bear in mind, particularly with regard to India. I think we know, we've seen presentations with regard to what Japan brings to the table. India brings to the table that it has lower costs in terms of implementing projects. It has low skills training that it can bring to the table, and it also has a history of South-South engagement that perhaps doesn't bring with it the baggage that comes with some of the more traditional donors. I think when we look at triangular cooperation, important to keep in mind that it benefits the recipient as well as the donor country, and that it's not only in the development interest of these countries, but in the strategic interest of these countries, including the recipients as well as the donors, in this case Japan, India, and ASEAN, to get involved in thinking about triangular cooperation. I, for the last few years, have been putting together a database on Indian foreign aid. So just a couple of graphs here to talk about Indian aid. I know we'll probably have some more of that in the next presentation. But just to say that Indian development assistance has grown remarkably over the past decade. And this is a graph of grants and loans in India. And you see that it's decreased over the last few years, but just picked up again this past year. So India brings quite a bit to the table in terms of amounts, around about $1 billion, sometimes a bit more, and somewhere around there this fiscal year, US $1 billion in grants and loans. But it's not just that dollar amount that we should be looking at. And this is the argument I've been making this the last couple of years, that we so often look at dollar to dollar comparison, not taking into account what the countries bring to the table. What is the advantage of a dollar coming from India versus a dollar coming from the US? And if you turn Indian development assistance into purchasing power parity dollars, which is how the World Bank compares, for better comparison reasons, you want to try and turn this around into PPP. Then if we look at the year 2016-17, in which India gave $1.4 billion in grants and loans, that $1.4 billion is actually in PPP terms $5 billion US dollars. By comparison, in the same year, Australia gave Australian dollars 3.8 billion, but if we turn that into purchasing power parity terms, it was 2.6 billion, or about half of what India gave in PPP terms. And you see that then leads us to think of India quite differently in terms of what they're bringing to the table. India's budget is much larger than one thinks if one considers it in PPP terms, and it has different kinds of comparative advantages that it brings to the table. This is just a little overview there to show you that, I think I'm missing a graph here, but Indian aid in terms of who it goes to, and this is for the upcoming fiscal year, the vast majority of aid goes to the region. There's been a lot of talk of India engaging in Africa. When you look at grants and loans, it's minimal. Most of the money goes to the immediate neighborhood and also eastward. Besides grants and loans, India also engages in line of credits, and they look much more like what China engages in terms of its line of credits. And there, again, the majority of the funds go to the region and not to Africa. As of January of this year, the open lines of credit that India has is 22.66 billion US dollars. So it's a significant amount, and I think important to look at. So when we take into account, we heard earlier through the US Build Act, the US is now putting $60 billion on the table to bring more resources into the Indo-Pacific region. JICA is increasingly focused on the Indo-Pacific region. There's much more funding also when you take into account India's growing resources put in that direction. The question, I think, is how to get more bang for your buck in this region. Just a couple more rundown of Indian instruments. There are a couple of new kind of lending instruments that have come online, and this is just to say that there's a lot of room for working together. India is trying to get the private sector more involved, and some of these facilities of taking, being able to take advantage, the Indian private sector being able to take advantage of subsidies by the government to work with other private sectors private sector representatives in, say, African countries. These are areas that instruments that India is putting online and that need better exploration. And then there's the strategic factor, right? This is just a map that I did a couple years ago of ports that India and China have invested in the Indo-Pacific region. This is largely the Indian Ocean here that I'm showing. But of course, you know, these are aid dollars going, but when you look at where they're going, I think there's not a question in anyone's mind that there's a huge strategic element to development cooperation, also from India's perspective. The fact is that we all wouldn't be here if China hadn't moved into the Indo-Pacific through the BRI, started putting its money into Sri Lanka, building out Hambantota Port, Gwadar Port, etc. And I think that's important to keep in mind. The Hambantota case study is also an interesting one. I know that it's been mentioned a couple times today, but I do want to say that I think we have to learn the right lessons also from these case studies. There were feasibility studies done by the World Bank in 2010, 2011 on Hambantota, and their conclusion was it was not financially viable. And yet, despite that, Sri Lanka approached China and China gave money. So I think the lesson from that is countries give development assistance for a whole host of reasons, sometimes for projects that are not financially viable. And one has to be more cognizant of these reasons and then think about, what are the strategic interests of India in terms of having a port, a Chinese port under a 99-year lease agreement that has strategic value right at India's doorstep. There needs to be a greater recognition of these strategic reasons, and it is important that Japan, India, and even ASEAN be more engaged in pursuing its own strategic interests in the Indo-Pacific through development cooperation. Not only in infrastructure, I think there are a lot of other studies where there would be benefits to both these countries as well as ASEAN getting involved. This is my last slide. Areas to explore besides port, there's increasingly discussions are looking at strategic possibilities of strategic ports such as Trincomalee and Sri Lanka, Myanmar. We've talked today about connectivity issues, other financially viable infrastructure projects, environmentally sustainable, new energy projects, but important to look at strategic projects. I put a couple pictures up there from a recent trip to Vietnam, my son, where India has some development cooperation projects going on. And to me, I kind of stood in front of this window there, that the structure that has been built up through Indian aid at the historic site of my son in Vietnam. And it made me think, how much better, frankly, this project could have been if JICA, for example, had been involved, right? So it's great that India is involved there, but I don't know if you can see from that photo in the top right, the thing about my son is some of these structures are 800,000 years old, and they were built without any mortar, and some of them are still standing. And yet, when they were put together through Indian aid, restructured and put together, they, in some areas, were put together quite sloppily with cheap products, cost overruns. We've talked about some of the drawbacks, right, and difficulties of Indian aid. So I think India brings things to the table, but Indian engagement, say in Vietnam, would be better if it were working together with Japan, with the technology that Japan can bring to the table, lower cost that India can bring to the table, and engaging through ASEAN structures, which give smaller countries greater leverage in having their voice heard. There's a whole host of cultural, strategic, and development interests that bring these three actors together, but one has to think more strategically, and I think it's important that ASEAN gets more involved because smaller countries such as Cambodia have little voice when it comes to countries such as China, who they are increasingly indebted to in terms of their balance of payments, and ASEAN is one way to think about giving more voice to these countries. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. And not to put pressure on Sanjay, but I think you're the last speaker. But I think we are going to have totally an Indian perspective on how you look at the trilateral cooperation. Over to you, Sanjay.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks to Carnegie India and Pallavan Learning Systems. Thanks to Rudra. Thanks to Darshana and also Sharanya. In terms of structure of international politics, we are in a multi-power order. The global geopolitical landscape is dotted with numerous powers, and this is more so in case of Asia. The emergence of multipolar order has also resulted in emergence of new constructs such as Indo-Pacific region. So in international relations, a region is not a given thing. It is a consequence of power politics. It is a consequence of the power constructs that come into play. So the future of Indo-Pacific will be defined not just by a few big powers, in my opinion, but it will also be defined by a combination of various powers. The age of unipolarity, bipolarity is long gone. We are in a multi-power order, so the regions are going to be defined by large number of powers. The fact that this is precisely the reason why we are talking about combination of powers such as Japan, India, and ASEAN. The fact that we are operating in a multi-power order implies that there are no structural constraints for the proposed trilateral cooperation. To phrase it differently, the structure of international politics today is more conducive for trilateral cooperation among many countries and organizations. The regional geopolitics is also being defined by larger structure of the international politics. There are now large number of powers and simultaneous absence of security architecture in the Indo-Pacific region. The US Hub and Spoke Alliance framework and the ASEAN consensus model are not comprehensive enough to cover the whole of Indo-Pacific. Therefore, the minilaterals or the trilateral frameworks that we are talking today tend to seek to bridge a strategic gap. They indicate the emergence of collaborative platforms for strategic deliberations and also signal, and they're also signaling mechanisms to major powers. India and Japan are two important pillars in this multi-power order. Domestic and foreign policies of these two countries will have significant impact on the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific region. Japan is the third largest economy, technologically advanced, probably without a technological peer in Asia. India is the sixth largest economy, one of the fastest growing economies at 7+% on an average. So the relationship between these two countries will define the power dynamics in the Indo-Pacific region. India and Japan have a robust developmental and economic partnership. Japan is the third largest investor in India. Who were the first two? Mauritius and Singapore. They are platforms. We know Mauritius and where the funding through Mauritius comes from. So for all practical purposes, for me, Japan is therefore one of the leading investors in India. Japan has been a robust developmental partner. We see it in metro projects, high-speed rail, and of course, Delhi-Mumbai industrial corridor. The bilateral relationship is marked by remarkable levels of trust. Japan is one of the few countries that is operating very proactively in northeast of India, which is strategically very important for India. There is also a convergence between India's connectivity vision, as was pointed out earlier, and Japan's connectivity vision in the subcontinent. There is a considerable overlap. We see it in the road projects in Mizoram, Meghalaya, or even connectivity projects in Bangladesh. New institutional mechanisms like India-Japan Act East Forum have been created. Both countries are exploring the possibilities, as was pointed out earlier, to work in third countries. For example, Sri Lanka has come into play. I mean, the possibilities of building an LNG terminal between Petronet and Japan's Mitsubishi and others is being considered. Of course, Chinese are in contention. Some news reports say that Chinese may already get it. But the point is that both the countries, these two major economies, are willing to collaborate, work with each other in the subcontinent and beyond. From an Indian perspective, ASEAN is one of the most successful organizations. I mean, if you compare it with European Union, as was pointed out earlier, it's a different story. But if you compare it with SAARC, ASEAN has been remarkably successful. So in that sense, for us, the success of ASEAN is very important. And its continued success is of greater importance for India. ASEAN demonstrated that countries with varied political structures can come together and work towards some form of regionalism. There are new challenges to ASEAN that are coming up. These include proactive territorial assertions and, of course, the refugee crisis and a segmented approach, a fragmented response to the refugee crisis has dented some amount of ASEAN's credibility. So to talk purely in terms of next steps, conceptually, how can India, Japan, which have a similar understanding of what is Indo-Pacific, right? India feels that it is from East Asia, eastern coast of Africa to the western coast of United States. Japan also shares the same idea of Indo-Pacific. But not all ASEAN countries have similar conceptions of Indo-Pacific. So how do you generate a conceptual understanding, convergence between India, Japan, and the ASEAN countries? Of course, Indonesia's conceptualization of Indo-Pacific comes closer to both India's and Japan's articulations of Indo-Pacific. I'm glad to hear that today morning Thai ambassador pointed out that ASEAN is planning to come up with a paper, preliminary draft on Indo-Pacific, and we need to see what kind of idea of Indo-Pacific that paper articulates. In terms of institutional issues, Indo-Pacific is a big region. So therefore, you cannot have a single overarching architecture, security architecture. Different subregions in Indo-Pacific will have different frameworks. For instance, the Bay of Bengal region can have BIMSTEC as the core around which the security and also economic cooperative activity can be conceptualized. And there are articulations to expand the BIMSTEC framework to include Indonesia and other countries. But we need to be careful when we are thinking in terms of expanding BIMSTEC frameworks, because there is a concern in ASEAN that it may undermine ASEAN centrality if there are multiple regional frameworks that slowly chip into ASEAN's territory. So that is something that needs to be looked at. On connectivity, there is significant possibilities of collaboration between India and Japan. Japan, of course, has a long history of cooperation with Southeast Asian countries. India is operationalizing various projects in its neighborhood. The Mekong-India Economic Corridor was pointed out. It needs to be expedited. There is a issue here in the sense that when you are conceptualizing cooperation in third countries, do you do joint projects together or do you do projects which are complementary? The preference seems to be to do projects which are complementary rather than joint projects, because it will result in easy implementation processes. This has consequences on how we conceptualize connectivity projects in India's immediate neighborhood and also overseas development assistance in India's immediate neighborhood. What kind of Japanese economic interventions can we have in Rakhine State, for instance, in a manner that dovetails into India's connectivity projects? Similarly, how should Indian investments and overseas development assistance be deployed in consonance with Japan's growth pole approach in Myanmar that is being operationalized? All this implies that ODA deployment between the two countries needs to be even more strategic. While the ODA is defined by strategic considerations, how do you bring these strategic considerations together of these two countries, India and Japan, and deploy it in a neighboring country? There is also scope for expanding the frameworks that we are dealing with in the recent past. For example, India and Indonesia in the recent past are discussing about connectivity between Sabang and Andaman and Nicobar Islands, as was pointed out. We need to think of the possibility of bringing in Myanmar into the mix to have greater maritime connectivity networks. After all, Myanmar is right next door. Japan here, of course, has a role not only in terms of financing, developing infrastructure, but also facilitating various processes related to this. Related to maritime connectivity network is the maritime domain awareness. India has created something called Indian Maritime Agency Center. It can share these experiences with Southeast Asian countries and collaborate with Japan to create common portals for sharing information on maritime domain awareness. How do you create these common portals? what are the technological requirements for that? These things need to be looked into in greater detail. India-Japan 2018 joint statement talks about collaboration and annual space dialogue. On the other hand, India is opening reception and tracking stations based on satellites in Vietnam and Indonesia. What are the other countries where we can do that? And more importantly, how can other countries be brought in? Friendly countries can be brought in into India-Japan annual space dialogue. We have an India-Japan Actist Forum that is focusing substantially on Northeast India in terms of implementing connectivity projects. I think there is a need to expand this and create a subcommittee or an alternative committee to look into implementing projects in terms of Bay of Bengal or Andaman and Nicobar Islands. The expansion of this Indo-Japan Actist Forum to include these new areas will give a significant flip to the implementation of various projects that are being conceptualized. There is another challenging issue that can also be looked into by India and Japan. For instance, India gives credit lines, as was pointed out, but for defense purposes to Vietnam. Almost $500 million was given recently, or extended. The credit lines were extended. Vietnam will use these credit lines to buy defense equipment from India. Japan is also working with Vietnam to upgrade its coastal surveillance capabilities of Vietnam. Now, is there a possibility of both India, Japan, and along with Vietnam sitting together and conceptualizing what kind of acquisitions should Vietnam make, and how should we use our respective credit lines and Japanese collaboration with Vietnam? There will be challenges for that, because if India is extending line of credit to defense purchases, it will expect Vietnam to buy equipment from India. And when Japan is selling equipment, it will sell its equipment to coastal surveillance equipment to Vietnam from its own inventory. But the point is, how do we ensure that there is greater convergence in the platforms that we are creating in Vietnam? That is something that can be examined. The last point I would like to make is that both are liberal democratic countries. I know it is not fashionable to talk about promoting democracy anymore, but the point is India and Japan seem to have an alternative approach to promoting democracy, in my opinion. We are not for a big bang approach to democracy. We would not like to bring democracy in one bang in some other country. On the contrary, both of them seem to be very interested in developing institutional frameworks, in developing capacity building. But the point is, how do you take this experience and convert into capacity among these countries to have conversations about connectivity projects that are being done by third country? How do we push the other countries to reflect about investments from other countries and what it is doing to them in a very democratic and a transparent manner? These are some of the issues that I think India and Japan can collaborate in third countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pulipaka, and I think it's been a fascinating 3 sets of presentations. I think very pertinent points were raised, so I'm going to have one set of quick questions for all the 3 panelists. Dr. Dua, I think you talked about, one of the really interesting question to look at is, as Vietnam assumes the ASEAN presidency next year, what are the prospects, what are the challenges of strengthening some of the ideas that have been kind of deliberated today? How do you see do you see any challenges, or are there any issues that need to be worked out, both in terms of identifying areas, but also in terms of the processes and institutional structures that are there? Second, you very interestingly talked about extending the trilateral highway to include Vietnam. I think the trilateral highway itself has seen several delays and so on and so forth, and I think that's been a problematic issue for India in terms of delivering on several of the infrastructure projects that have been promised but not delivered on time. So huge delays, significant delays, and I think that has affected India's own credibility and name in this regard. So it came as a good idea, but again, what's the feasibility of that is something that I'm quite interested in. Dr. Mullen, again, you repeatedly brought out the Sri Lanka issue as a case in point in a sense. And I think that brings me to a very important question. For instance, of course, the Hambantota port is on a 99-year lease because of the debt repayment issues. But the 2019 debt repayment issue came up. Where did Sri Lanka go to? It went back to China, asking for a fresh infusion of money. So what happened to all the major Indo-Pacific powers in this region What happened to India? What happened to Japan? Where is Australia? Where is the US? What happened? So do you see it as a failure of these countries and some of the major Indo-Pacific powers in not able to reach out to countries that may be interested in doing a pushback? I'm not too sure of Sri Lanka, how that fits there. But there are several countries who are doing a pushback on China, but at the same time, one is that they need alternative options in terms of assistance and kind of thing. Second, in case of even China, in case of even Sri Lanka, why is that, why some of the other immediate neighborhood countries like India, it's in our own backyard, why is it that we did not really reach out, and how do you see that as a failure kind of thing? And Dr. Pulipaga, I think that, again, you brought in very interesting set of issues, and you touched upon mostly the strategic aspects, and towards the end you talked about some of the capacity building issues. On the strategic aspects, one thing I have a question is, of course, I think the big elephant in the room is being China that we have been constantly talking about. But I think even as the Indo-Pacific countries are talking about China, I think there are different conceptions and different ideas about those sets of concerns about China are very different for different countries. For India, for instance, I think the Chinese increasing footprint and influence in the Indian-Ocean region is what is driving, what is giving India nightmares, sleepless nights. But at the same time, for Australia, it may be a very different set of issues that might be of concern. Japan, it could be a very different. So how do you bring about some sort of a coherent viewpoint, some sort of a sharing of ideas, shared perception among the key Indo-Pacific countries in developing a shared idea of Indo-Pacific, and also how do you manage China in that sort of sense? Do you see sort of some sort of a strategic coherence emerging in the coming years among India, Japan, and ASEAN? ASEAN has been very interesting. ASEAN has been a model in terms of economic integration, but the minute you brought in some of the tricky issues, and even in terms of endorsing the Indo-Pacific concept, there have been some sort of apprehension because of the possible negative reactions from China and so on and so forth. They do like the concept, but at the same time, whether they want to endorse it openly or not, I think that's a set of an issue. So I think each of the three actors have an interest in promoting and nurturing the Indo-Pacific concept, but a possible negative reactions from China is one set of issues, but also the different concerns about China. How do you actually build a sort of a coherent narrative about these set of concerns about China? Dr. Duas?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the very good question. I think that next week, exactly 1 week away from now, so next Wednesday, we will have a conference in Hanoi, also organized by our academy, Diplomatic Academy, and also other relevant partners as well, to discuss about ASEAN centrality and also the prospect of Vietnam chairmanship in 2020. So I wish that I attend that seminar before I coming here so that I can share a lot more to you. But before anything can be figured out, I think that there are a couple of opportunities and challenges for the trilateral cooperation between Vietnam, India, and Japan during 2020 when Vietnam assumed the ASEAN chairmanship. The first thing is we can see that over the past year, Vietnam has served as a bridge that connecting both India and Japan to the various network of ASEAN. So I think that in 2020, when we serve at ASEAN chair, that pretty much will have the impetus for broadening the trilateral cooperation in a multilateral framework. And second thing, we can see that some of the point of concern of Vietnam at the moment, the first thing is economic development, particularly how to reduce the gap between ASEAN 6 and ASEAN 4. So the two-tier development ranked between I think that that is a case in point that Japan and India can pretty much have with the Mekong sub-region, but also the development in the Indo-China, or what we call here the continental ASEAN. And also another point, opportunities, I would think that in terms of the security cooperation, particularly maritime security, because you know that in the reverse chairmanship of Vietnam in 2010, so Vietnam coined the initiative of ADMM Plus, and also pretty much promote the code of conduct in the South China Sea. So I think that maritime security may be another point of concern during the Vietnam Chairmanship. And lastly, in terms of the opportunities, that is simultaneously in 2020, Vietnam also likely to assume the non-permanent role in the UNSC. So it means we will conduct the two roles at the moment. So it means there may be some connection between the regional framework and the larger framework as well, and particularly how to promote the ASEAN voice and also the regional voice at the UNSC. So I think that those are the key opportunities, but there are also some challenges as well. I think that the biggest challenges for Vietnam in the coming years is how to maintain ASEAN unity and also ASEAN centralities in the evolving regional architectures when you see that the return of great power politics, but also a number of other initiatives as well. So how to keep ASEAN remain relevant and also stay central in the regional architecture will be a huge task for any chair, not only Vietnam. And we will see how Thailand is doing this year in order to gain experience for the next year. And the second thing that I think that there are some something that have been left discussing, including RCEP and other like FTAIP. Those has been very much discussed and negotiated for the past year, but have not come into conclusion. So I think that probably if RCEP and other initiatives should not, cannot be concluded this year during the Thailand chairmanship, probably it will be passed on to the next chairmanship, and Vietnam has to settle as well. And all those are very tough issues. And lastly is also the China factor, how to balance the relation among the big power. So ASEAN, most ASEAN countries at the moment stay hedging, adopting hedging policy. So in the coming time, with the Indo-Pacific intertwined with BRI and a couple more initiatives. So how to balance the relationship between ASEAN key dialogue partner, that will be a huge task for ASEAN chairmanship.
The quick answer to your question is China was not there for financial reasons. They still are there, not for financial reasons. And India and others better wake up to that fact. I think it's important. You know, I went last year to a conference on Trincomalee. There were, I think, 2 Indian participants there. One of them was here earlier. There were 7 or 8 Japanese there. But I think that said something about, you know, this is right at India's doorstep, and India is still not thinking about this, you know, leveraging, partnering with others to think about the strategic implications of not getting involved.
Yeah, in fact, around the same time when this whole discussions was on, I talked to some of the officials and said, you know, this is happening. Why isn't that? Oh, why should we bail out China? We are not here to. So I was like, this is going to have a serious problem. And in fact, you are helping, pushing these countries into Chinese way increasingly. If we don't step up, then it's going to be a serious problem. Absolutely, yeah. Okay. Sanjay.
I mean, when China initiated its Belt and Road Initiative, we are one of the few countries that actually said, no, this is not a healthy thing to do. There are fairly large number of people and large number of countries that said you are being excessively propelled by security considerations. A few years down the line, now we see more skepticism in various countries, so which validates India's point. And there is also pushback in terms of people experiencing Belt and Road projects, debt traps, and political instability that comes from it. But will it result in some kind of a strategic coherence, as you pointed out, in contesting Chinese Belt and Road Initiative? Doubtful, for 2 reasons, in my opinion. One is that business interests in various countries, they think that this is an easy way to make some quick money by doing quick developmental projects, especially in many of these countries which are not actually transparent. This is a way to make some quick money at the cost of national interests. So that's one dimension. The second dimension is when countries are experiencing political transitions, the leadership wants to demonstrate some quick, massive projects. So therefore, Chinese projects come into very handy because they implement very quickly, of course, through various other means. So therefore, in my opinion, to develop a strategic coherence, the domestic politics in the region are going to be a challenge. But coming to Indian subcontinent, there is already some apprehension within the subcontinental countries. We have seen it in Sri Lanka, we have seen it in Bangladesh and other countries. And of course, we have a longer history of engaging with these countries. Probably in the Indian subcontinent, we can contest the Chinese presence through our own developmental assistance, and of course, our own presence in the ethnic politics of neighboring countries. So that gives us a leverage. But at other places, I don't think we are in a position to contest Chinese presence dollar to dollar.
I think we started a few minutes late, so I guess we have about another 10, 15 minutes max. Yeah, over to you.
My question is for Sanjay Pulipaka. Did you say that BIMSTEC would undermine ASEAN? You said something on that, right? If you said that, was it based on your speculation or based on any statement from ASEAN? Could you clarify
No,
that?
what I meant is we have heard a lot of scholars from ASEAN expressing concern that the Indo-Pacific security discussions are undermining ASEAN centrality, because so many conversations are happening outside ASEAN framework that have an impact on ASEAN security issues. So therefore, there are concerns about ASEAN centrality. So when we are talking about Indo-Pacific security issues, I was saying we need to be a little more cautious and bring the Southeast Asian countries on board when you are conceptualizing regional frameworks. The new need regional frameworks. Thank you.
Dr. Siddhartha?
Siddhartha from NIAS in Bangalore. Question to anyone who might answer. Would Japan be willing to fund an Indian designed and built nuclear power plant in Vietnam?
The same question that Darshana gave you, the answer that she gave you, does Vietnam want such a design and a plant? I doubt.
Okay, let's ask the Vietnamese if they want one and if the Japanese are willing to. I think there are three sets of parties that need to come together. So I think anyway, but the first point is whether the Vietnamese require one and they need such a power plant that is designed in a truly trilateral fashion.
Previously, there's a plan to build a nuclear power plant in Ninh Thuận in Vietnam, but that after the 2011 incident in Japan, Fukushima, so after that, the Vietnamese government have somewhat suspend that plan. So at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, it has not been discussed in that term, in terms of what we has been cooperating with India and Japan in other aspect of civil nuclear energy, but not that particular project in terms of nuclear power plant.
Question at the back, last table, and I'll just come back to you.
Ma'am, my question is to Rani Mullen. First thing is that you talked about India's aid to other countries. It is not increasing, and other things as that India's aid is also related to the domestic politics of those particular countries. Like this year, the aid to Maldives has increased 4 times. Last year it was 110 crore. This year it is nearly 500 crore. These are some factors which are also in the thing. Now, if it could be if a regime changes in Maldives or Bangladesh or Sri Lanka, do you see this consistency in the Indian foreign aid pattern? First, and then second one is that you have talked about the trilateral aspects. There is another trilateral which is called JAI, Japan, America, India. So where do you put this trilateral into the infrastructure finance?
you know, development cooperation is about two partners, and is engaged in when the other partner is interested in it. So you mentioned the Maldives example. The previous government was not so interested, not as keen in working with India. So I think you see these sort of ups and downs given the sort of domestic politics, and that's of course only natural. You also see that with big projects, you know, the aid to Afghanistan from India came down slightly this past fiscal year because a dam was constructed in the previous years. That was quite a bit of money. It finished, and so there are cycles that explain development cooperation with individual countries. With regard to the US and Japan in India working together, in third countries, is that your question, of them working together? I mean, so far, the triangular cooperation has been just India and Japan and other countries, and US and India in a third country. And those are very few small examples. It's still in the early stages. So to scale that up and bring another development partner in, I think, might make it slightly unwieldy because it's really quite difficult already. But I do think that it points to the difficulties that smaller countries have in engaging with multiple donors, all with their own forms to fill out, all with their own processes, and that streamlining by working together, by better coordination, is really in the interest of the donor as well as the recipient. Thanks.
Thank you, and I think on the right.
Hi, my name is Jaydeep. I have two small questions anybody can answer. One is, these are very high-stake projects, like multi-billion, trillion kind of, and there are multiple stakes like bilateral, trilateral, multilateral. Are there any external or internal pressures that change the directions of these projects? Number one. Number two, I heard a few of the projects at a later stage got deteriorated because of lack in funds. Is it result of poor management or poor planning that this lack of fund happens? Because whenever a project starts, I hope funding would be very appropriately chosen, selected to finish the project very handsomely, smartly, completely. How come then in between, in the middle or at a later stage, funding gets over? So how does it happen? Who takes away that funds?
I mean, I can give you with some practical examples, in the sense that, for instance, in Nepal, we started small development projects. What was the intent of the small development projects? That you will work with the local governments and to implement these projects, right? Now that there is a new constitution and the local governments, everything got restructured. So how do you take forward these projects which are halfway through? That is a challenge. There is a fundamental change in the federal structure of Nepal. So there will be delays now. The problem is not India, the problem is the country going through a transition. Go to Myanmar, for instance. Before transition, after transition, even during transition, there are so many power shifts that are happening. And at the same time, you need to factor in local people when you are constructing something. And the local political military commander changes, things change. So the projects will change depending upon those factors. So therefore, there are a host of reasons in the neighboring countries why Indian projects are delayed. And we don't work in a certain faction like other countries do, like one of our bigger neighbors. I mean, we don't go around throwing around money to get things done. So there will be challenges in that sense because we have to factor in the political changes in the neighboring countries.
One example that Dr. Rani stated about the one she went with her son and that some monument built in Vietnam, and the ending was very poor because of lack of funds. So what could be the reason for that?
Yeah, it's not necessarily lack of funds. It might just be poor execution and you know, at some stage funds being siphoned off, right? I mean, so that might be the issue. But I don't think, you know, there are cost overruns, there are political changes in the recipient countries. It's not always the case that India has budgeted X amount, and when that money runs out, then the budget stops. For example, with the Afghan parliament building, which was initially slated to be 2 or 3 years, it ended up taking, I think, 6 years to be built, at double the initial cost. It, you know, every year the budget was increased and extended. So I think it just depends on the specifics of the politics and the recipient country, the willingness to, and resources available, and the execution in the country. I mean, well, there are many examples, not only of Indian aid, but US aid and other donor aid that is poor in execution in the recipient country.
Is there any third-party pressure? I think we can carry this forward during the reception. I think if we are running over the time, over the time limit, so if there are no other pressing questions at this stage, then we would bring the discussions to a close. It's been a terrific panel, and I'm not going to try and kind of sum up the discussions. But I think some of the points I'm still kind of wondering as to how do you build that coherence in terms of the thinking among the three key actors. One aspect that I have is, for instance, can the three countries think, or can the three players think about certain amount of burden sharing in a sense? Every country, all the three set of actors don't have to get involved in all the different spots in a sense, whether it is something in the Pacific Ocean, or in the Indian Ocean, or the South China Sea, the East China Sea. Every country, every actor does not have to get involved in every little conflict, every little issue, but at the same time, some sort of burden sharing may be a way to kind of think about. But I think that's something that we can carry forward this particular conversation during this next reception. At this point of time, I want to thank all the three panelists for a terrific conversation out here. Thank you, and a big hand of applause to everybody here.
Thank you, everyone. With that, we come to the close of this day-long conference. It has most certainly been a day of interesting conversations and ideas. There were some great steps for practical collaborations that came through the day-long conversations, and we will continue to explore and debate these new areas of collaborations. Just a quick round of thank yous. Thank you to Ambassador Hiramatsu, Ambassador Gongsak-di, Ambassador Preeti Saran, and Dr. Srinath Raghavan for taking the time out and setting the stage for this conversation. To all our speakers and moderators, thank you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and insights, especially to our international speakers who have joined us here from different countries, from different ASEAN countries. Thank you for sharing your perspectives with us. To the audience, thank you for spending the day with us, and for your questions and pushing the panelists to really expand on some of the ideas that were put forward. Finally, to my colleagues at Carnegie India and Pallavan Learning Systems for putting together this very important conference. Thank you again, and we look forward to continuing our engagements with all of you through our conversations and research. Now, please join us for a reception which is right through these doors by the pool set. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.